From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman, who just sold his iPhone to pay for health care.
No, you got that wrong. In order to pay for health care, I sold Jason Chaffetz's iPhone to the Russians.
Okay. Very good. And, of course, we have the man. That's very ingenious, David, I have to say.
Thank you.
And we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. Do we ever have a program for you listeners today?
Oh, yes, we do. On the show today, we are going to discuss how to defend against tyranny in a time when many of our democratic institutions appear to be under attack, from the judiciary to the press to the election process itself. And we're going to be doing that with Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University, an expert on authoritarian movements in Europe, who has written a book entitled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, which I know, David, gave you a massive anxiety attack, right?
Seriously, it did. Please continue, but it scared me. We have like a year left in the Republic, and it scared Go ahead, please.
Well, speaking of anxiety attacks, we're also going to talk about the cruel and unusual federal budget proposal put out by the Trump administration last week and what it means for ordinary people. We will also check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, the Axel Foley of the Corporate Crime Beat. And if we have time, we'll try to get to some of your listener questions. But first, let's get to the topic of tyranny. Now, during the presidential campaign, then candidate Donald Trump retweeted this quotation, quote, "It is better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep." When it was pointed out to him that was, quote, came from Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, Mr. Trump passed it off by saying, "Hey, look, Mussolini was Mussolini." Yeah. So our question today is Donald Trump Mussolini? And here to help us answer that question is our first guest.
Professor Timothy Snyder is a leading American historian and public intellectual who is the Howsam Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He has written many award-winning books on European history, including Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. In his latest work, he takes much of what he has learned about fascist movements and forms of totalitarianism that took hold in Europe and fashioned it into something of a handbook for the possible threats to democracy that appear to be emerging right here in America. It all started as a Facebook post about a week after the election of Donald Trump and was shared over 17,000 times. It's entitled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Timothy Snyder.
Very glad to be with you.
Welcome indeed. This is an extraordinary book, listeners. It's very short. It's a little paperback, and it should be read by everybody who is worried about where the country's heading. And I mean that. And we're going to show exactly what Professor Snyder intends to result from a book like this. This is a book to be read. He starts out by saying we might be tempted to think that our democratic heritage automatically protects us from such threats. This is a misguided reflex. In fact, the precedent set by the founders of our country demands that we examine history to understand the deep sources of tyranny and to consider the proper responses to it. Americans today are no wiser than Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism in the 20th century. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience. Now's a good time to do so. This book presents 20 lessons from the 20th century adapted to the circumstances of today. And you open your book with a very short quote by Mr. Kolakowski. And the quote is, "In politics, being deceived is no excuse," end quote. Just to illustrate what we're going to talk about, I'm going to quickly go through the 20 lessons from the 20th century. And I'm going to go through them in just about a minute. Do not obey in advance. Lesson 1. 2, defend institutions. 3, beware the one-party state. 4, take responsibility for the face of the world. 5, remember professional ethics. 6, be wary of paramilitaries. 7, be reflective if you must be armed. 8, stand out. 9, be kind to our language. 10, believe in truth. 11, investigate. 12, make eye contact and small talk. 13, practice corporeal politics. 14, establish a private life, protecting privacy. 15, contribute to good causes. 16, learn from peers in other countries. 17, listen for dangerous words. 18, be calm when the unthinkable arrives. 19, be a patriot. 20, be as courageous as you can. Now, it's difficult to do justice to the book, even in the 30 minutes that we have, but let us try. Professor Snyder, and he's given me permission to call him Tim, why don't you talk about first one that you called Anticipatory Obedience? I see you as a modern Paul Revere, but instead of a horse and a loud voice, you've written this book. So this is going to increase the level of urgency because he uses historical context, comparisons, and aggregates of what's happening today that we absorb as snippets from day to day on the TV, radio, or newspaper. What do you mean by anticipatory obedience? And under lesson 1, which is do not obey in advance.
So this is an important lesson that we have precisely from Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933, as well as from a number of other regime changes since. We tend in our imaginations to imagine tyrants as unstoppable forces, almost as a kind of supervillains who have unbelievable power from the outset. But that's not really the case, especially at the beginning. Much of the power of an authoritarian regime is freely given. And the way that it's freely given is that we adjust automatically to new circumstances. And in our everyday life, our personal life, our social life, this is perfectly normal and appropriate. It's how we get along. We take in cues subconsciously and adjust. The problem is that there are moments in politics where this is terribly inappropriate, where if we don't take stock of a radically new situation, if we automatically adjust, we take a step forward that we can't reverse. This is what happened in Germany in 1933. It also happened in communist regime changes in Europe a decade after that. And so the first lesson, which seems easy, but actually it's really hard, is to say, hold on, this is a moment where I have to think for myself. I have to stop my automatic adjustments. I'm going to think for myself and figure out where I stand. I'm not going to drift. And if nobody drifts, which unfortunately isn't the case, right? But if nobody drifts, that already can slow down the process quite considerably.
Yes. Well, it all comes in increments, step by step. You don't think it'd ever happen in your country. It can't happen here. And each step downward aggregates and accelerates. Because in lesson number 2, defend institutions, you say, quote, the mistake is to assume that rulers who came to power through institutions cannot change or destroy those very institutions, even when that is exactly what they have announced that they will do. And so why don't you give us a quick comment on what you mean on institutions? I mean, you mean courts, legislatures, and other institutions.
Yeah, this one, of course, like the whole book, goes back to the Founding Fathers and their intuition about human nature. The Founding Fathers were the opposite of American exceptionalists. There wasn't an America yet, and their whole premise was human nature has to be guided so that we can preserve freedom and justice and equality. And so when they set up institutions precisely for the scenario that we have now, right, the thing they were worried was about a tyrant who would rise to power and then who would cancel elections and so forth. So one set of institutions are precisely, as you say, the constitutional ones. We have to be friends of the court. We have to urge our legislators to try to balance the executive. Another set of institutions, and this is something we have rather from the 20th century, another set of institutions are the professions, the journalists who we need to support, we need to subscribe to newspapers, the lawyers who need to think of themselves as forming a profession with an ethic, policemen who need to understand that sometimes there are moments when orders can't be followed, doctors, and so on. If professions see themselves as being surrounded by a kind of ethic, that can make a huge difference. And this is not a trivial point. Just to give you an example, the lawyers in Germany after 1933 flipped, basically went over to the Nazis. The majority of commanders of the Einsatzgruppen, the mass murderers in the East, were in fact people with law degrees. And we all know what doctors did under National Socialism. The third group of institutions are the NGOs, the ones that spring up from below, the kinds of things that the East European anti-communist dissidents of the 1970s called civil society. And this is so important.
These are the citizen groups, the NGOs.
Exactly, citizen groups.
Yes,
citizen
these
groups,
are all
yeah,
citizen groups that many of you belong to. Yes, go ahead.
Exactly. And so all of you know how important these are. I mean, we have this myth that freedom is just the lonely individual against the all-powerful state. But the truth is that a lonely individual is never going to win in that confrontation. The individual has to be made not lonely by associating with people who also care about the same cause. This has psychological importance, it has intellectual importance, and in the end it has political importance because it creates this middle layer between the individuals and the state.
And you also talk about civil servants, like the present Trump administration, by announcing all these massive budget cuts and deregulation, is destroying the mission of a lot of these health and safety agencies like EPA and Food and Drug and Auto Safety. And civil servants are leaving voluntarily because they don't want to be told to violate their oath of office, which is to uphold the statutory missions of these agencies. And this is exactly what the Trump people want. They want these people so they can put their own people deeper and deeper into the civil service. And you point that out. When that barrier against tyranny starts falling, that's a very serious sign of deterioration of any kind of democratic society. Your third one is beware the one-party state. Well, I've talked about the two-party duopoly being increasingly similar to one another, dialing for the same dollars, same foreign military policy. But you had a more advanced definition of the one-party state.
So it's, in a way, it follows on nicely from your last question, because the way that regime change takes place is often quite gradual. Very often the party which becomes the one party in the one-party state already existed beforehand, and it slides into being the one dominant party. In the United States, we're in an unusual situation. We have, as you say, a two-party system which generates strange leadership choices, as we've just seen. The risk now is that we only have one party which is in charge of all three branches of government, which puts the idea of checks and balances at risk. It also means that we face a strange situation where Republicans at the top, not because necessarily they're bad people, although of course some of them are, can be tempted away from the system as we have it, right? Because now if we're going to have elections in 2018, they're responsible for everything, and they basically have no popular policies. That's not a great mixture, because it means that you can be tempted towards some kind of state of emergency. You could be tempted towards some other pulse of politics besides just waiting for the elections of 2018. But the basic lesson is that, whether you like Democrats or not, right, whether you like Republicans or not, there has to be some kind of alternative for there to be a meaningful political system of the kind that we're used to calling democracy. The present setup is unfortunate, not just because of who happens to have executive power.
You have something very interesting in this section. You not only say, quote, when fascists or Nazis or communists did well in elections in the 1930s or 40s, what followed was some combination of spectacle, repression, and salami tactics, slicing off layers of opposition one by one. Most people were distracted, some were imprisoned, and others were outmatched. And you make a call to fix the gerrymandered system so that each citizen has one equal vote, and so each vote can be simply counted by a fellow citizen. We need, you say, paper ballots instead of machine-counted ballots. We need paper ballots like Canada has. Quote, we need paper ballots because they cannot be tampered with remotely, and they can always be recounted. This sort of work can be done at the local and state levels, end quote. We go on. 4, take responsibility for the face of the world. Describe that.
So, again, we know from history that what people get used to seeing around them is very important. To go back to 1933 in Nazi Germany, when people got used to seeing the swastikas or got used to seeing neighborhood shops, for example, marked as Jewish shops, either with the word, Judah, or with the Star of David, that changes people's notion of what is normal, and it changes it very fast. The aesthetic turns out to be incredibly politically important. The first time you see something, you might be surprised. The second time, you might be startled. The third time, you take it for granted. The fourth time, it becomes normal. And what this is, as a number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have already realized, whether it's in Poland or whether it's in Manhattan, What this is an opportunity for people to whitewash those swastikas. If you see them, it gives you an opportunity to do your own part to change what everyone's physical environment is like. So it's an easy way to take action, which, like a lot of other lessons in the book, actually can have profound consequences for your fellow citizens.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite, the fifth one. Remember professional ethics. This one will resonate with our listeners. Let me just quote quickly a passage. When political leaders set a negative example, professional commitments to just practice become more important. It's hard to subvert a rule of law state without lawyers, or to hold show trials without judges. Authoritarians need obedient civil servants, and concentration camp directors seek businessmen interested in cheap labor, like prison labor in private prisons in our country already. One should elaborate. Remember professional ethics. This is extraordinarily important in terms of the levels of opposition to a society creeping toward authoritarian or totalitarian ends.
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons why this is important. One is, this is going to sound very, respectable of me, but one is precisely respectability. Lawyers, doctors, members of the professions do actually still enjoy a certain standing in this country, and the statements that they might be able to make, like the statements of, for example, law school deans a few weeks ago, do actually have still a certain amount of resonance. The second part is that people who are in these professions need not to feel that they're acting alone. This goes back to salami tactics earlier. It's important that individual lawyers or individual policemen or individual civil servants who behave badly understand that they're behaving badly, that they're acting against the norm that their colleagues actually believe in and uphold. And the third thing, the most elementary thing, is the just not going along, right? And here I have to say, my standard, as people always remind me, is a very low one. But lawyers in the U.S., and again, there are some important exceptions, people who should be disbarred because they've perjured themselves, right, like Sessions. But the lawyers in the U.S. have actually behaved much better thus far than lawyers in Germany in 1933.
So far, but when it comes to criminal wars of aggression under Bush and Obama, they have behaved very badly. But just recently, 150 corporate lawyers representing 150 corporate law firms wrote to President Trump objecting to his proposal to erase in the budget the support of legal services for the poor, a $400 million budget where millions of poor people can have access to courts, whether it's tenants or whether they're abused by police or what have you. There's a lot to go there, and you should go over to Yale Law School and give them a piece of your mind, Professor Snyder.
I've done that.
Oh, good. The sixth one is beware of paramilitaries. This is an extremely important section. Why don't you describe it succinctly?
Well, as you've been so kind as to emphasize, I'm a historian, and so when I look at the landscape of American political and social life, what I'm reminded of are things that I've seen before, incipient possibilities that could lead to things that I've seen before. What we often leave out when we think of the rise of, say, National Socialism in Germany is that it involved precisely paramilitaries. The groups that we remember as the SS and the SA, Hitler's guards, Hitler's stormtroopers, these began as precisely a security detail that guarded Hitler during his rallies and threw out journalists and oppositionists. And then he kept them around when he was in power, and they became a kind of non-state, extra-legal source of violence, active first in the concentration camps and then during the invasions of Eastern Europe, active on the scale of entire countries, carrying out, for example, the Holocaust of European Jews. So these kinds of actors which are somehow allowed to use violence, even though they're not part of the state, are extremely dangerous in regime change and then in the escalation of violence afterwards. And of course, this is something that we have to be concerned about because we're a country that has more guns per capita than, basically any society in the history of the world. And I think we have to be a little bit alert that all these people who have always been saying they're keeping guns as preservation of themselves and their families against the state, we have to watch out and make sure these people don't line up and start forming paramilitaries in favor of the executive. That's something I'd be watchful for.
But more to your point on page 44, quote, because the American federal government uses mercenaries in warfare and American state governments pay corporations to run prisons, the use of violence in the United States is already highly privatized. What is novel is a president who wishes to maintain while in office a personal security force which during his campaign used force against dissenters, end quote. I thought also the conclusion to this section was extremely compelling. And I must tell the listeners, a lot of Professor Snyder's examples are from the area of his expertise, which is Nazism, Stalin, Europe. But another academic with background in Asia or South America or Africa could have given similar examples. These are not unique to Nazism and Stalin. But anyway, you close this section by saying, for violence to transform not just the atmosphere, but also the system, the emotion of rallies and the ideology of exclusion have to be incorporated into the training of armed guards. These first challenge the police and military, then penetrate the police and military, and finally transform the police and military, end quote. You can see how some advocates who oppose gun control see this kind of scenario, Professor Snyder, as further argument for them to hold weapons in their homes and businesses. They can see something like this coming. They're not entirely paranoid. The seventh one, be reflective if you must be armed. This is a good segue.
So just as we might overlook how important paramilitaries are or sort of semi-organized violence is to regime change, we also overlook how quickly simple police forces can switch. So when we consider the history of the Holocaust, we think of death facilities. We might remember the Einsatzgruppen, the elite SS officers and so on. But what no one remembers is that, including the Germans, is that ordinary policemen actually killed more people than the Einsatzgruppen. That regular uniformed policemen, the kinds that we see every day, people not so different from our policemen, or to be more broad about it, ourselves, stood at the edge of death pits and shot tens of thousands of people at a time. So part of the transformation of the system is a transformation of policemen, and we know this is always imperfect. I'm giving it to you in a kind of, conceptual way, ideally. The transformation of policemen from people who are meant to enforce the law, from people who are meant to be, as Goering and Himmler called them in Germany, racial warriors, people who violate the law in the most direct way by carrying out murder in some higher cause. And the striking thing about all this, and the work of Christopher Browning and others who work on the history of the Holocaust shows us, the striking thing about all this is how easy it is. If you convey to policemen that they're in a state of exception, that this is an emergency, that the people in front of them are somehow associated with an imminent national threat, it turns out to be shockingly easy to bring this sort of thing about. And so hence that lesson is directed precisely to the people who are already bearing arms, right, in our republic. That there does come a time, or there can come a time when you have to be reflective, where you have to ask yourself, am I actually serving the ends that I'm supposed to be serving when this particular order comes down?
And just an excerpt, you say the NKVD in Soviet Russia, here's what you say, quote, even so, you're talking about the thousands of political murders under the NKVD in Soviet Russia. You say, quote, even so, they could not possibly have carried out this campaign without the assistance of local police forces, legal professionals, and civil servants throughout the Soviet Union, end quote. You get real personal in number 8, Professor Snyder. We're talking with Professor Tim Snyder, Yale University historian, his book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And the title of number 8 is Stand Out. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a bit like number 1. We talk about freedom in this country all the time. We talk about it to the point where it becomes a cliche. But you're not really free unless you're thinking for yourself and capable of doing the thing which puts you at odds with the people around you, not to provoke them, but just because you have some notion of what authentically is yourself and what authentically you stand for and ought to be doing. And the point of that lesson is that individual choices, or really the first choice, to be an individual, matter immensely. That the drift, that we feel at times like the present can seem overwhelming, but a few individuals who just behave slightly differently send out their own normative message, set their own example that other people can follow, even though that's not immediately apparent. So in that chapter, I take an example that everybody knows, which is Winston Churchill in the Second World War, and one could have said the same thing about FDR, incidentally, and point out that his views about fighting the Germans were actually rather unusual at the time, and only after the Allies won the Second World War did what he did seem normal and heroic. And then I take an everyday example of a young Polish woman, a girl really, who chose to go into the ghetto and rescue some family friends. She did these things because she realized that the drift towards abandoning one's Jewish friends was abnormal, or she saw it as abnormal, and decided that she was going to set her own normality. And that's the word that these Holocaust rescuers, by the way, always use, is normal. And they don't mean I was doing what everyone else did, because they weren't. They mean I was doing what I think should be normal. And that ability to stand out by setting your own idea of normal, which is attractive, I think, at any time, becomes politically extremely important at times like this.
Well, you also have 9, be kind to our language, and you say, quote, avoid pronouncing the phrases everyone else does. Think up your own way of speaking, even if only to convey that thing you think everyone is saying. Make an effort to separate yourself from the internet. Read books, end quote. And in this little section, you talk about what television does to people and looking at screens do to people's frame of reference, and it's not positive in your view. But you also say, when we repeat the same, and I'm quoting, when we repeat the same words and phrases that appear in the daily media, we accept the absence of a larger framework. To have such a framework requires more concepts, and having more concepts requires reading. So get the screens out of your room and surround yourself with books. The characters in Orwell and Bradbury's books could not do this, but we still can. And you list some books that people should read. Number 10, because time is short, you say believe in truth. This one is very current in terms of post-factual societies or alternative facts in our national politics. You want to describe that, believe in truth?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really bracing one. I no longer think we have the space or the time for just saying everything is a matter of opinion, because if everything's a matter of opinion, then what happens is the best financed opinions win. And the internet has only made this more true than it was in the age of television. Even if we don't know exactly what the truth is, I think we have to be quite earnest and straightforward that our job in life, or at least in political life, you quoted Leszek Kolkowski at the beginning, is not to be deceived. It's to try to figure out the facts as they are, rather than allowing, larger forces, larger trends, larger narratives to influence us all the time. And this stands at the basis of our whole political system, because to be an individual means not wanting to hear what people think you want to hear, but figuring things out for yourself. And the opposite of, our own Republican tradition, our own constitutional tradition, the opposite, I think, would be the fascist idea, which says there aren't any facts. There isn't really everyday life. There are only grand stories. There are only myths. There's only the mystical union of the people and the leader. And we see that idea creeping in under the new slogan of alternative facts or alternative reality. So the stakes really are high here. We're not in a moment when one can afford to be indifferent about the facts. It's actually a deep philosophical question about whether you believe you're an individual or not, and whether you think that a constitutional system can work or not.
You refer to a scholar on totalitarianism, Victor Klemperer, who basically said that truth dies in 4 modes. And the first is open hostility to verifiable reality, which takes the form of presenting inventions and lies as if they were facts. That one resonates with President Trump in the White House and his accusations, I think. The second is what he calls shamanistic incantation, and that is where you just endless repetition of very short slogans or descriptions, like Donald Trump called Ted Cruz lying Ted, Hillary Clinton crooked Hillary, repeated again and again and again, and repeated over the media again and again and again. The third mode is magical thinking. Everything's going to be great. All the promises, everyone's going to get health insurance, there are going to be plenty of jobs. And the fourth was called misplaced faith. Quote, it involves a sort of self-deifying claims the president made when he said that, quote, I alone can solve it, end quote, or, quote, I am your voice, end quote, referring to President Trump. I'm curious, Professor Snyder, you do refer very accurately to how Trump operated to win the election and his short stay so far in the White House. But you never mention him by name. Is there a reason for that?
There is aside from superstition, there is a reason for that, which is that I think that the problem that we face cannot be reduced to an individual. And although Mr. Trump does exemplify, for example, precisely these fascist speech patterns, and although I noticed that in 2016 and it made me very concerned then, it's not about him. I worry that too much of our discourse, or our critical discourse, gets wrapped up in, personal characterizations, imagining that it's just a matter of some kind of psychological issue with Mr. Trump. And that we make the same mistake with other fascists. It's easy to look at Mussolini or Hitler or Perón or any authoritarian leader and say, aha, there's just a psychological problem there. But maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but it didn't stop them from taking power and oppressing people for very long periods of time. So what I'm after here is a program that allows us to, in a sustained way, resist an authoritarian regime change, regardless of who's on top. And I'm also after, a kind of political hygiene. Even if Trump's impeached tomorrow, which isn't going to happen, these things most of them would be good practical guides for trying to revive an American democracy. We can't say, go back to 2016. That makes no sense. We have to have in mind some version of America which is better not only than what we have now, but what we had in 2016.
Well, your other lessons really resonated with me because I've just put out a little paperback, too, called Breaking Through Power, It's Easier Than We Think, showing that throughout history and even at the present time, it never takes more than 1% of engaged people representing majority opinion to challenge power and redirect it in the area of a more just society. So just to speed things up, 11, you have investigate, in which you say, figure things out for yourself. Spend more time with long articles. Subsidize investigative journalism by subscribing to print media. Realize that some of what is on the internet is there to harm you. Learn about sites that investigate propaganda campaigns, some of which come from abroad. Take responsibility for what you communicate with others. And that goes right into your next one, which says 12, make eye contact and small talk. Yeah, small talk can be very important talk with neighbors and friends and relatives. And you say, quote, this is not just polite. It's part of being a citizen, a responsible member of society. It's also a way to stay in touch with your surroundings, break down social barriers, and understand whom you should and should not trust. And then you go to practice corporeal politics, which most people don't understand that word, and I had trouble too. But it says 13, that's the 13 lesson. Quote, power wants your body softening in your chair and your emotions dissipating on the screen. Get outside. Put your body in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar people. Make new friends and march with them. End quote. That's like getting out of your bubble, isn't it? It's like breaking your routine. And then 14 is on stop having companies and Facebook invade your privacy, invade yourself. You lose part of your freedom that way. You get intimidated that way. You get co-opted that way. 15 is contribute to good causes. Many of the great changes in America come from the civil society, the citizen groups that our listeners belong to. And they need to have more staff. They need to have more capability to reshape the political and electoral systems and the corporate structures. So you have one there that's very good. And 16, learn from other countries. We don't have a monopoly of good democratic small ideas. Learn from other countries. And at 17, you have listen for dangerous words, like, the way they use the word terrorism to manipulate people, extremism. I just wrote a column, Professor Snyder, saying that trillions of dollars are spent in the war against terrorism to keep our country safe. And yet, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, among other studies, came out with a report last May that 5,000 Americans a week die from hospital mishaps. That is, hospital malpractice, hospital-induced infections, hospital errors, bad combinations of prescription. 5,000 a week, and they said that was the minimal estimate they came up with. These are the physicians at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And then 18, maybe this is what raised the fear factor with David Feldman. 18 is be calm when the unthinkable arrives, which is another way of saying don't panic. Stay cool, stay stable, don't let people push you toward the cliff. The 19 one is, I see it, you say, be a patriot, set a good example of what America means for the generations to come. They will need it. And Professor Snyder, it defines patriotism perhaps just the opposite of the way President Trump behaved as a candidate and a president. And the last one is be as courageous as you can, which sort of speaks for itself. You've got all kinds of literary and historical references in this tiny book, which should be read in every living room in America and given to students everywhere. Let me ask you, have you been on NPR or PBS yet?
I was on NPR, week before last. I haven't been on PBS yet.
How about the mass commercial media? Have you been on any of the dwindling interview shows on Sirius Radio around the country?
Yeah, I've been on some pretty serious stuff. I mean, and I'll be on the Bill Maher show on this coming Friday night. So a little bit, but I haven't quite broken through to the big, long interview on the morning or in the late evening.
I think it's coming, though. It's too compelling. You do pay attention to short attention spans brilliantly with your concise 20 lessons. David, Steve, do you have any final questions for Professor Timothy Snyder, Yale University?
I've got one, and it's based out of arguments that I have with friends all the time about the rise of Trump. And knowing what you know about European history, you know Mussolini, Hitler, these people did not arise out of a vacuum. So in your estimation about the last 10, 15, 20 years in America, what happened in America that allowed the rise of Donald Trump, that made him even considered presidential timber?
Yeah, I mean, so as a historian, I tend to think that it has to do precisely with forgetting about history, with this big idea that history was over. And, therefore we don't have to know the details. Therefore we can forget the critical concepts. Therefore we can imagine that everything is going in the right direction. And that's, we can accept some kind of, people like the word neoliberal. I don't like it so much, but, we can accept some kind of vision that the market is going to bring democracy and everything's going to be fine all over the world. I think that sets itself up for its own defeat because it's just not true. Those kinds of stories are not true, whether they're communist or whether they're capitalist. And when you believe things like that, it means that you forget about reform, you forget about agency, you forget about responsibility. In practice, it meant that we have terrific in the sense of enormous inequalities, especially local inequalities in this country, which means that people are looking for shortcuts to the American dream, and that's exactly what Mr. Trump offered them. We also have the problem that we have way too much money in politics, which means that Mr. Trump could say, well, I'm a billionaire, I'm an oligarch, but at least I'm your oligarch. There are no oligarchs standing behind me, which is an argument you can only make when the American people are convinced, and unfortunately they're right, that money plays too much of a role in politics. So those, those things, and there are other things like the fact that the Republicans over the last 30 years have been working from the ground up to build local party organizations in a way that the Democrats haven't, and that's something that Mr. Trump then accidentally benefited from in 2016 after he became the candidate.
David?
Yes. Since you published, are you surprised by the resilience of the Republic? Do you think there's more time left?
Given the demonstrations, you mean?
Yes.
No. I wrote the 20 lessons a week after the election, and when I wrote them, people generally thought that I was just way off the mark, that I was being way too alarming. By the time the book came out at the end of February, more people thought that I was closer perhaps to the real world. And the more time goes by, I think that the more resonance the ideas have. So no, I am just as worried about the Republic as I was before. There are some encouraging signs, like the women's marches, the continuing marches, the ones that we'll have next month, like some of the lawyers, but there are also discouraging signs, like the normalization that we see on television, like the normalization that we see among smart people in Washington D.C. And I worry about the Reichstag fire scenario. I worry about the state of emergency, where normal politics doesn't seem to work, something dreadful happens, and, they take advantage of that. So I'm I'm pleased and proud to be among people who are following these kinds of lessons and are taking responsibility and are taking action individually and collectively. But I am still very much concerned about the fate of the American small R republic. I think this is a time of trial, a kind that we have not had for generations.
One encouraging sign is filling the town meetings all over the country when senators and representatives go back home. Congress has turned itself into a willing autocracy. The incentives were all there. And that's very encouraging that they're focusing on the most powerful branch of government, the 535 men and women who have to go back home. We know their names. That's very, very encouraging. And I'm sure as you go around the country and you speak to millions of people over the media, Professor Snyder, you're going to find a lot of resonance here. And for people who think this is a undue alarm call, just read the book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Professor Timothy Snyder, historian at Yale University. Thank you very much.
It's been my great pleasure. Thank you.
We've been speaking to Professor Timothy Snyder, Distinguished Professor of History at Yale University and author of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's take a short break and check in with corporate crime reporter Russell Mokhiber. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, March 24, 2017. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A series of internal Monsanto documents revealed last week via a court order show that the company's long-standing claims about safety of its top-selling Roundup herbicide do not necessarily rely on sound science, as the company asserts, but on efforts to manipulate the science. Congressman Ted Lieu of California has called for an investigation by Congress and by the Justice Department to look into the matter, and he is advising consumers to immediately stop using Roundup. We need to find out if Monsanto or the Environmental Protection Agency misled the public, Congressman Lieu said. U.S. District Judge Vince Chabria is overseeing more than 55 lawsuits brought by individuals filed by people from around the United States who allege that exposure to Monsanto's Roundup herbicide caused them or their loved ones to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. And last week, the Trump administration unveiled its budget plan, which previous Radio Hour guest Robert Reich immediately dubbed, quote, an orgy of cruelty for absolutely no reason, unquote. Well, here to help us drill down a little deeper into the details is our next guest. David?
Deborah Weinstein is the executive director of the Coalition of Human Needs. It's an alliance of national organizations working together to promote public policies that address the needs of low-income and other vulnerable populations. The coalition's members include civil rights, religious, labor, and professional organizations, and those concerned with the well-being of children, women, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Deborah Weinstein.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a real pleasure, all those years that you've been working for the poor and the vulnerable, Deborah Weinstein, to have you on our show. I want you to list briefly some of the outrageous cuts in the proposed budget, which isn't the detailed budget that comes out in May by President Trump. It was just a 50-page summary, but he made his intent clear. And my view is that if we have any resiliency in our society, all these different programs, of course, efficiencies can always be improved, but all these different programs will be given more publicity and more interviews throughout the media to see the benefits that they have been extending to the poor and vulnerable and disabled Americans among us. So let's start with a description of some of the 10 or 15 programs that are being cut.
Well, it's almost too numerous to mention. We haven't seen such a collection of upside-down priorities in recent memory, in decades. And this includes programs that help make us more secure as a nation, because these programs help people get out of poverty and be able to live decently with their families. So that includes many education programs. It includes programs that help low-income children from preschool through college. It includes totally eliminating an after-school and summer program that helps both children do better and also helps their parents work. It says it substantially cuts the work-study program. So all of our values about how young people should work to help them get through school, it throws a gigantic roadblock in that direction. It cuts Pell Grants, which are college grants for students, all of which particularly victimize low-income students. It cuts K through 12 education programs. So that's, just a sampling in the education area.
It also cuts energy assistance for the poor, food assistance for the poor. It eliminates program of legal services for the poor having access to justice to defend themselves. It's really right across the board. But as you and others have pointed out, if you total up all these cuts, they're a very tiny proportion of what the $54 billion more for the bloated military budget, the Pentagon, amount to. For example, the cutting out legal service for the poor is $400 million. And that's the range of some of these programs are $200 million, $700 million. But you add them all up, and they hardly can make up for what President Trump says savings, he calls them, to increase the military budget. Isn't that correct?
Well, they do manage to make a lot of cuts, and they do add up to billions of dollars, but they help millions and millions of people, and they advance the economy. On the other hand, the money that they want to spend on the military, it flies in the face of what we really need when there has already been a study by the Defense Business Board that says that there's $125 billion of waste in the military that could be addressed. That's not helping our national security. But all of these cuts in housing and job training and allowing low-income people to have their homes heated and food, as you say, food assistance, Meals on Wheels even cut, all of those things really help our national security.
What kind of boomerang is this going to cause? I mean, I've noticed the press, they go to some of the beneficiaries of these programs. They're a very human interest, reaffirmations of the value of these programs. What kind of political boomerang or citizen boomerang you think this is going to generate if he persists in unveiling these cuts in his formal budget this coming May?
What's starting to happen is people are starting to see some of the details, and of course they're very alarmed. Yesterday I spoke before a group of people with disabilities or whose children have disabilities. Many hundreds have come to Washington from all over the country, and they are going to visit their members of Congress, and they are saying, please tell me that you will reject these cuts that in programs that allow my child to manage or that allow me to manage and prevent me from having to go into, say, nursing home care and allow me to remain in the workforce. So as people know these details and they start to talk to members of Congress, I think it's going to show much more or force much more understanding of how programs are really working to help people. That's what we need. But the fear is that when you propose so many things all at once, that the details get lost. And that's the danger, that these wrong-headed and false talking points about we're just cutting programs that don't work. If that's all that people hear, we're in danger. If people learn the truth, I think Congress may reject many of these cuts.
I think you're right. I sense a rumble from the people coming in on those town meetings that some members of Congress are holding. In fact, they're coming back to Congress, Deborah Weinstein, shaken. They really are. I mean, when they see these auditoriums for these town meetings, usually mostly empty seats, and suddenly they see them jammed with people standing outside to get in, that's the rumble from the people that focuses on the one leading institution that can block all this vicious, cruel cuts by Trump and his associates, and that is Congress. It's Congress, it's Congress, it's Congress. It's your senator, it's your representative. Eyeball him face to face back home. You cannot believe the impact when they come to Congress. They talk about it in their offices, in their corridors, in the gym, and they say, gee, you know, what's going on back here? So you're already seeing some Republicans in Congress backing away, especially on the Meals on Wheels one, which is going to haunt Trump unless he drops that one fast. They're backing away already. They're distancing themselves. So take heart, people out there. Show up at those town meetings. There are a couple major recesses coming up, and the big August recess is a whole month. So if they don't want to have town meetings, get to them early and say, if you don't schedule a town meeting, senator or congressperson, we're going to schedule our own town meeting, and we're going to tell you the location and the time, and we're going to fill those seats, and you better believe you better be there. You better show up. And in my book, Breaking Through Power, it's easier than we think. I have a draft summons from the people to their senators and representatives, where the people, turning the dynamic completely around, summon their legislators back to the town meetings shaped by the people themselves. So I think there's going to be a rumble, but we can't take anything for granted. What are all your groups and affiliates doing, Deborah, to focus?
Yes, we're doing exactly that. Thank you for mentioning that. One of the kinds of ways that we operate, if you don't mind my saying, if people go to www.chn.org, they can get on a list where they'll receive information about when these very harmful cuts are coming up in Congress, so they know when and how to be effective. We encourage people to do that. No, democracy is not a spectator sport. Never has there been clearer proof than now. And to say tomorrow is the day that we expect the House of Representatives will vote on this god-awful health care law that guts health care and dismantles Medicaid. The concerns that we've talked about today, so many are addressed through the Medicaid program, would be absolutely catastrophic if that bill isn't allowed to pass. So this is democracy in action time. Everyone should contact Congress.
On that note, Deborah Weinstein, let me quote something you said on March 16th, a few days ago. Quote, in this budget, children, seniors, and working families pay so that the Pentagon can speed up the purchase of the failing F-35 Stryker planes. Military contractors appear to benefit far more than the American people do. In the Trump-supported health care bill, the insurance and medical industries, as well as wealthy people, gain hundreds of billions of dollars, while 24 million people lose health insurance, and many more will see their costs increase. The Trump priorities are clear, and they're putting our future at risk, end quote. Those are the words of Deborah Weinstein. And I might say this, Deborah, the head of some of these defense companies, like Lockheed Martin, are making $20 million or more. Just the boss, the CEO, $20 million right out of the mouths of poor children, one might say. And all that money is paid for by you, the taxpayer. So if 95% of the business of these defense contractors comes from the government, meaning you, the taxpayer, why does the government allow these CEOs to be paid $10,000 to $15,000 an hour, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year? So when you talk to your members of Congress, personalize it like this. That's what makes them remember the rumble from the people.
That's right.
At these town meetings.
Thank you so much. I thank you so much for quoting me in that way. Your point is completely right. And that's why I started by saying I have never seen such upside-down priorities. This is a shift from the vast majority of us either to the Pentagon or to the rich and, health insurance companies and medical companies and other profitable corporations. This is completely backwards, and undermines our security, and we can't let anyone forget it.
And the pushback may come out with a stronger country, a stronger citizenry. That's what's important, to use this as an opportunity to reaffirm the humanity of our society, question some of the inefficiencies in some of these programs, challenge the bloated military budget and its priorities to destroy more and more of the countries abroad and create more enemies for us. One last question, and there are very good websites for people. If people say, how do I find out more about this? I'm middle income. I don't use many of these programs. How do I find out about it? Give that website again, Deborah, of this coalition of Americans that wants to come out stronger from the Trump ravages of the taxpayer budget and the grotesquely misplaced priorities.
Thank you so much. Please look for the Coalition on Human Needs at www.chn.org. And we have compiled information from a great many different websites, so it's kind of one-stop shopping to find what you need to know.
There it is, right on a platter of justice. CHN, N as in Nancy. Thank you very much, Deborah Weinstein, for all your years of work and for preparing for a resurgence of our democratic society to challenge and destroy this cruel savagery coming out of the plutocracy and the oligarchy. These people don't represent America. These people don't represent our best traditions, our best values. Teach them a lesson. Thank you very much, Deborah.
You're so right. Thank you for covering this.
We've been speaking with Deborah Weinstein, Executive Director of the Coalition on Human Needs. We have a link to that organization at ralphnaderradiohour.com. And I also want to thank our first guest, Timothy Snyder, whose book is On Tyranny, 20 Lessons for the 20th Century. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. Welcome, podcast listeners, to the Wrap-Up, little odds and ends of conversations we had with our guests. Plus, we're going to have some listener questions also included in the Wrap-Up today. And let's start with those.
Ralph, this question comes from James Evans. What do you think of the open town meetings and the semi-direct democracy in Switzerland? More power to the people, and it helps keep them engaged.
For sure. It's the most democratic society in the world, by far. The cantons work on direct democracy like they had a very high minimum wage, maybe $20 an hour, and the people voted it down, saying it was too much, too fast recently. On the other hand, they voted in many progressive ways. Switzerland is considered the best economy in the world in terms of reaching the most people in a country. In terms of livability, livelihood, it's now number one. I think we're at number 11 on this rating system. I was just there recently, and it's quite an extraordinary place. The politicians don't have a dirty name because they're rotating citizens, a lot of them. So
they're not professional politicians.
Yeah, and they're going through, different tensions and strains, but we should have their problems.
How do they balance providing a social safety net and that massive military spending?
Well, they don't have our system of budget priorities. They have industries that are relatively clean. They're not polluting raw material conversion industries. They're sort of high-tech, refined machine tool industries and the like. They have a great safety net. Their infrastructure is much better repaired and kept up to date than ours. They have an area where there's a lot of German-speaking people, area where there's a lot of French-speaking people, area where there's Italian-speaking people. So it's not linguistically homogeneous, but they also are known for some of the greatest cooperatives, consumer cooperatives. The two big consumer co-ops account for over half of the food sales. And one of them, Migros, which was started in 1939 by a businessman to break the soap monopoly, has adult education. They have one of Switzerland's leading newspapers. They have auto insurance. They're into a lot of different areas. So there's no multinational dominance. They obviously have dominance multinationally in the drug and banking industry. similar to ours, big drug companies, big banks. But on many issues, it's all referendum. The people vote. It's worth studying from a U.S. point of view comparatively, and there are some good books on the subject.
Does their democracy predate American? Is the Canton system, how old is that?
I'm not sure of that.
Yeah.
Well, that was kind of similar to my question, is that did they learn from us, or should we learn from them?
No. I think they're sui generis. And I think they realized, because of the linguistic divisions and all, that they had to do it democratically, that one division could never be allowed to dominate all the others.
Hitler could have taken over Switzerland, but he didn't. Is that because he didn't want to jeopardize the banking system during World War II?
Partly, and partly it wasn't that strategic for him, and partly it was very mountainous, and partly he would have had a heck of a fight.
Really?
Yeah, definitely. That's one reason he didn't try to take over Sweden, because they had a military and they knew the terrain. And, of course, in Switzerland, they really knew the terrain.
Well, and he knew what happened to the Soviets in Finland when they tried to invade Finland. Yeah. This next question comes from Cheryl Baptista Roeder, and she says, does Ralph Nader still believe there is no difference between Republicans and Democrats?
Well, that's another myth about what I didn't say. I said the following, that on many important issues, there is almost no difference in reality between the Republicans and Democrats. Military power, foreign policy, big money in politics, criminal justice, like they both supported expanding prisons and private prisons until the last months of the Obama administration. Wall Street, the Clinton was very close to Wall Street, both Clintons, and so they talked a good game a little bit, but they never did anything. Corporate tax reform, they never did anything, both parties. Now, on the social safety net, they were different, and I pointed that out. Obviously, on Social Security, on Medicare, on children's programs, the Democrats were more supportive and more humane. But look at these other big issues where, regardless of nuances of rhetoric, there wasn't much difference. There wasn't much difference even in some consumer areas. The Food and Drug Administration was bad under the Republicans. It was bad under the Democrats. Dr. Sid Wolf can document that from the Health Research Group of Public Citizen. I can tell you that in the auto safety area, until very recently, in the last 2 or 3 years of the Obama administration, the heads of the Auto Safety Agency and the Department of Transportation, NHTSA heads, as it's called, were as bad as each other, whether it was Democrat or Republican. So let's put it this way. There is far too little difference between the Republicans and Democrats on corporate power, concentration of power, and a lot of regulatory areas. What difference was there between the Republican and Democrat and the Federal Reserve? In fact, Clinton reappointed Alan Greenspan, who was a Republican choice years before. And the Federal Reserve is a pretty big ticket item for both parties to have the same policy toward. And then take electoral reform. Not only do they dial for the same commercial dollars for their campaigns, they both have supported gerrymandering, which destroys a choice of two candidates. One party in power in the state controls the elections. There's really only one candidate on the ballot who's very likely to win, Democrat or Republican. And on electoral reform, apart from the McCain-Feingold bill, they may talk different, but in reality, they don't do all that different. Yeah, there are differences in the appointments to the Supreme Court. I'll grant that. Republicans nominate far less people-responsive judges than the Democrats. For example, Bush put into office with the Senate confirming Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, who are very corporatist and supported Citizens United decision that opened the floodgates for corporate contributions to or against political candidates without limit and with little disclosure, as long as they didn't coordinate with the candidates. And President Obama appointed Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor, who are quite different in dissent from the 5-4 Republican majority. So the summation is, don't we deserve more, broader, deeper choices on very, very important redirections and situations in our country that I've just pointed out? Or do we constantly have to be confronted with least worst choices? And every 4 years, when you have a least worst choice, the corporations are pulling both parties 24/7, and the voters are voting least worst. Every 4 years, both parties get worse.
And then after the Tim Snyder interview, this was said.
There are some silver linings to Trump. He provokes people in doing things that they wouldn't ordinarily do for the public good.
Yeah, that's one way we should let ourselves be provoked. Yeah.
Yeah, you might not have written this if Hillary Clinton won the Electoral College.
Of course not.
By the way, there's another example of how the Electoral College takes away the public vote. And we wouldn't even be talking about Trump now if it wasn't for the Electoral College. And you know about the movement to get rid of it, Interstate Compact?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's out of California. Yeah. We had Steve Silberstein on a few weeks ago. They're up to 165 electoral votes. They've got New York, I think New Jersey. They got New York, California, Illinois, others saying they'll throw the Electoral College votes to anyone who wins the national popular vote. So that's the way where you don't have to amend the Constitution.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's really interesting. No, it's funny. We have so many barriers to one person, one vote. The special ones for African Americans, but beyond that, there's so many of them. The gerrymandering, the money in politics. We're so far away from actually being a democracy, unfortunately. But yeah.
That's why I say it's all about Congress. That's the big fulcrum right there, and that's 535 people.
Ralph, I was glad you said that, because that was amazing. By the way, that was just incredible. That. In many ways, this reminds me of Apollo 13. We remember Apollo 11, and then we remember Apollo 13 as NASA's greatest moment. There is an Apollo 13 opportunity here, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there is. Look at all the American people will now be educated about the social safety net, which he wants to eliminate. People are talking about meals on wheels, you see. People are talking how helpful it is. They're giving interviews. So that's where the resilience that you pointed out comes in. If we have resilience, we can win. If the resilience has been novocained, then we're in real trouble. And it's all a matter of reaching critical mass.
After we talked to Deborah Weinstein, David asked Ralph this.
Ralph, I had a question for you about Budget Director Mitch Mulvaney saying that cutting food meals on wheels is an act of compassion for the coal miner in West Virginia.
Yeah, give him the Orwellian Award of March 2017. These guys are crazy, I'm telling you. They're nuts. You should read my recent columns.
A coal miner in West Virginia who pays taxes, does any of that money go to anything other than Medicare, Social Security? There's no money that a coal miner in West Virginia pays that would be.
Yeah, he pays income tax to support corporate welfare, which of course Mulvaney doesn't talk about. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year, crony capitalism to the right wing, corporate welfare to us. Yeah, he's very glib and very, very glib, fast talking. These people are going to go down in history as the pits. The pits.
Yeah. Do they know that about themselves, or is it just...
look at them. They all have good salaries, nice homes, health insurance. Congress has life insurance. Congress has housing assistance, $3,000 a year, last I checked. All expenses. They have a fantastic pension that even is good by business standards. And we're paying for all these benefits. That's why the more you personalize it, the better.
Yeah, the idea that, on the whole healthcare debate, why don't you give up your government healthcare and see how you do?
Come under the same rules you want to put on us.
Right. All those same character building rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A transcript of this episode will be posted on ralphnaderradiohour.com.
For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
Remember to visit the country's only law museum, the American Museum of Tort Law in Winsted, Connecticut. They're having a special event on political satire April 1st. Go to tortmuseum.org for more information.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Leewert and Matthew Marin.
Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and we'll talk to you then, Ralph.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Steve. Remember, go to imagine.org, and they'll tell you when the senators and representatives are having town meetings in your community coming up. And for listeners of WPKN in Bridgeport, you're only a short drive from opening day for the Tort Museum, April 1. Go to tortmuseum.org. It's a great event.